My hands shook so badly that the pages of the Bible fluttered like autumn leaves. Everyone was watching me. 60 pairs of eyes fixed on me as I stood frozen at the pulpit, holding the scriptures I had never been allowed to read. Father Thomas had just called Jennifer Blackwood, the daughter-in-law of the parish council president, to do the reading that was rightfully mine. The reading I had practiced for weeks for my only daughter's wedding. My dear friends, thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking this time to listen to my story. This channel is still just beginning, and every new subscriber is like a breath of fresh air, helping us reach that first milestone of 1,000 supporters. If my story touches you even a little, please click subscribe. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Sharing that helps us feel more connected, like a true community. The morning light came softly through the sheer curtains of my kitchen window, painting the room in a gentle glow that seemed almost too peaceful for the storm brewing inside me. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the warm scent of blueberry pancakes sizzling on the griddle. I stood by the stove, flipping them carefully, the rhythmic sound filling the silence. It was early, and the house was still quiet except for the faint chime of the church bells ringing somewhere down the street. St. Michael's, their call a reminder of the sacred place that had bound my family for generations. I was Eleanor Winters, 67 years old, a woman who had lived her entire life within the walls of this parish. I had baptized my children here, buried my husband here, and raised my daughter Catherine with the steadfast faith and traditions handed down from my mother before me. My silver hair, neatly styled, caught the morning light as I carried the breakfast tray to the dining room table where Catherine sat, waiting. Her eyes, the same soft blue-gray as mine, sparkled with a mixture of excitement and nerves as she glanced at the spread before her. The delicate lace of her wedding dress was still tucked away, but the day weighed heavily on both of us. "Mama," she said softly, reaching for a plate. "Thank you for doing this. For everything. It means so much." Her voice was tender, but I sensed the unspoken weight behind her words. This was more than just breakfast. It was a symbol of support, of love, and of the hope that the day would go exactly as it should. I smiled, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "You don't need to thank me, darling. Today is yours." But beneath the calm surface, a knot had tightened in my chest for weeks. Weeks of rehearsing my scripture reading every morning and night. Weeks of offering the church money for the flowers. A gift, yes, but also a quiet assertion of my place in this sacred space. $2,000 in lilies and roses, arranged meticulously to decorate the altar. I had wanted everything to be perfect for Catherine's wedding, for her to feel the warmth of family and faith surrounding her like a gentle embrace. Yet, the tension between Father Thomas and me lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. I remembered the first day I met him. His sharp eyes, his clipped words, the way he held authority like armor. Over the past 20 years we had clashed more times than I could count. Not over faith itself, but over the way the church's resources were managed, how the donations were handled, and the silence expected when I dared to speak up. I was a loyal member of St. Michael's, but I was no pushover. And so, as I set the table and poured the coffee, I found myself battling a storm of emotions. Pride in my daughter, sadness for the distance between me and the man who held so much power in our community, and a quiet fear of what today might bring. After breakfast, Catherine and I sat together in the sunlit living room. The walls, painted a soft cream, were decorated with family photos. Catherine at her baptism, her first communion, and countless moments of laughter and love. The familiar creak of the old wooden floor beneath my feet grounded me. I ran my fingers over the pearl brooch pinned to my blouse, the same one my mother had worn on her wedding day. It was a symbol of continuity, of endurance. "You're ready, aren't you?" Catherine asked, her voice steady but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I nodded slowly. "I've been ready for weeks." She smiled, reaching out to squeeze my hand. "I know, and I'm so grateful. It means everything to me that you'll be up there, reading the scripture." It was a small moment but one I clung to tightly. The thought of standing at the pulpit, my voice steady as I read the passage from Corinthians, words about love being patient and kind, felt like a chance for redemption. For me, for us. Despite all the struggles, this was my moment to shine, to reclaim a place I knew was rightfully mine. Later that afternoon, I made my way down to St. Michael's. The grand stone exterior of the church stood tall against the blue sky, its towering spires reaching upward as if in silent prayer. The familiar scent of polished wood, old hymnals and faint incense greeted me as I stepped inside. The sanctuary was bathed in soft light filtering through the stained glass windows. Vivid blues, reds and golds casting intricate patterns on the stone floor. I had spent countless hours here over the years, yet today felt different. I carried with me a sense of cautious hope, but also a lingering unease. Father Thomas was already there, standing near the altar, his hands folded neatly beneath his black cassock. He acknowledged me with a curt nod, his expression unreadable. "The flowers look wonderful," he said, his voice low. I smiled, though it didn't quite reach my eyes. "Thank you. I wanted everything to be perfect for Catherine." He nodded again, then gestured toward the service booklet on the lectern. "You'll be doing the first reading." His words were clipped but final. I felt the familiar tremor in my hands as I opened the booklet and traced the words with my finger. Corinthians. The passage I had practiced over and over. The words that had carried me through so many moments in my life. Words that now felt heavier than ever. As the days passed and the wedding approached, I continued to rehearse in the quiet of my home. Ruth, my dear friend of over 4 decades, was my constant companion during these sessions. She sat in her favorite armchair, her kind eyes watching me with gentle encouragement. "You're ready, Ellie," she said one evening. "Your voice has the perfect balance. Not too formal, not too emotional. Just right." Her words soothed my anxieties, but the tension with Father Thomas gnawed at me like a persistent ache. At the rehearsal the night before the wedding, I had hoped for reassurance, some sign that the priest respected my role in this sacred ceremony. But he brushed past me, barely acknowledging my presence as he prepared the order of service. "Just follow the program," he muttered when I asked about the sequence. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat and forced a smile. Perhaps I was overthinking it, I told myself. Maybe it was just nerves. But deep down, a warning bell rang loud and clear. Back home, I tried to distract myself by focusing on the details. The soft rustle of the wedding dress as Catherine moved about, the delicate aroma of the gardenia bouquet she had carefully chosen, the gentle hum of well-wishers preparing for the celebration. Yet, beneath it all, an undercurrent of doubt persisted. The morning of the wedding, I dressed carefully in my navy blue dress, the color a quiet tribute to strength and dignity. I pinned my mother's brooch near my heart, taking a deep breath to steady my shaking hands. The scent of my favorite lavender perfume filled the air, a small comfort in the storm of emotions. Arriving at the church, I felt the weight of history pressing down on me, the generations who had walked these aisles, the years of devotion, the battles fought quietly in the shadows. I sat in the front row, clutching my purse tightly, my knuckles white. Around me the congregation gathered, their faces a mixture of joy and anticipation. I caught Ruth's reassuring smile from a few rows back, a fragile lifeline in the sea of strangers and familiar faces alike. Catherine sat beside her soon-to-be husband, Michael, radiant and nervous, their hands intertwined. When the moment came for the first reading, I rose quietly, the Bible trembling in my hands. My heart pounded so loudly I feared it might burst through my chest. But then, Father Thomas's voice cut through the silence with cold clarity. "For the first reading, we welcome Jennifer Blackwood." The words hit me like a blow. Jennifer, the daughter-in-law of the parish council president, stood up hesitantly from the opposite side of the sanctuary. Our eyes met for a fleeting moment, hers wide with surprise, mine filled with a mixture of shock and humiliation. I remained frozen for a heartbeat. As the reading concluded and the ceremony moved forward, I sat silently, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. The warmth of the flowers, the soft murmur of hymns, the flickering candlelight, all felt distant, irrelevant in the face of this profound betrayal. Yet amidst the pain, a quiet resolve began to take root. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of something new. And as I watched my daughter walk down the aisle toward her future, I vowed to find my voice again. Stronger, clearer and unyielding. Because sometimes, the silence we endure is the prelude to the loudest declaration of all. The moment Father Thomas uttered Jennifer Blackwood's name, my world tilted on its axis. It was as if the entire sanctuary had suddenly shrunk, the air thickening like a heavy fog pressing down on my chest. My hands, which had been trembling already, now shook uncontrollably, the fragile pages of the Bible fluttering like autumn leaves caught in a sudden gust of wind. I clutched the book tighter, willing my fingers to steady, but the muscles refused to obey. Every pair of eyes in the room was on me, 60 sets of curious, expectant, and increasingly confused gazes. Some faces were familiar, warm with celebration. Others distant, eyes flicking with barely concealed judgment. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, burning a scarlet path from the base of my neck across my face. My throat tightened painfully, a knot so fierce I struggled to swallow. Jennifer's name echoed in my ears, a cruel refrain I couldn't escape. I saw her hesitantly rise from her seat, her delicate frame seeming small in the grand church, her green eyes wide with uncertainty. Our eyes met for a brief instant, hers shimmering with confusion, mine clouded with a mix of disbelief and humiliation. It was as if time slowed, stretching the silence into an unbearable expanse. For a heartbeat I just stood there frozen, the silence deafening. Then came a cough, a nervous clearing of a throat. The congregation shifted, unease rippling through the pews like a sudden chill. I searched Ruth's face in the crowd, hoping for a sign, any sign of support or understanding. Her lips parted in shock, eyes wide enough to break my heart. My breath came in shallow, jagged gasps. I could taste the sharp tang of panic on my tongue, feel the cold sweat gathering at the small of my back. My legs threatened to buckle, but I forced myself to remain upright, rooted there in the center of that sacred space that had been my refuge for decades. Michael, my son-in-law, glanced at Catherine with a furrowed brow, like he was trying to silently ask, "Is this really happening?" Catherine's eyes were locked on me, full of pain, confusion, and something else, fear perhaps for what this moment meant beyond the wedding day. Her hands clenched tightly in her lap, fingers trembling. I felt utterly exposed, laid bare before a community I had served faithfully for years. The Bible in my hands seemed suddenly foreign, the sacred words blurring as tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. I wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, to reclaim what was rightfully mine, but my voice was nowhere to be found. It felt swallowed by years of silent compliance, by the weight of tradition and authority. The seconds dragged on, each one a silent indictment. The priest's deliberate decision to call Jennifer instead of me was not an accident. It was a calculated slight, a public erasure of my role, my presence, my worth. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound I had ever known. As I finally lowered the Bible to my lap, the rustling sound of its pages was loud in the quiet. The fabric of my dress felt suddenly heavy against my skin, as if soaked in cold rain. My hands resting on the book were cold now, clammy, trembling with the mix of shock and fury I was only beginning to recognize. Jennifer's voice rose hesitantly, faltering over the words I had memorized so many times. "Love is patient, love is kind," she began, her tone uncertain, as if she too sensed the tension that crackled through the room. Every phrase was a knife twisting in my chest. Not because the words themselves were painful, they had always been a balm to my soul, but because they underscored the injustice of the moment. The love I had shown my daughter, the faith I had nurtured over a lifetime, all dismissed in a single humiliating gesture. My heart pounded fiercely, a drumbeat of anger and sorrow. The once familiar sanctuary, bathed in the golden light filtering through the stained glass, felt cold and alien. The lilies and roses I had paid for seemed to mock me with their delicate beauty, their fragrance overpowering in the heavy silence. I could feel the eyes of the congregation burning into me, the whispered questions just beneath the surface, the unspoken discomfort. I wanted to disappear, to vanish into the shadows where my voice would never be silenced again. But I could not move. As Jennifer's reading stumbled forward, each word a painful reminder of what had been taken from me, I fought the urge to stand up, to speak out, to make them all see that this was more than a simple mistake. This was a message of exclusion, a reminder of the invisible walls built within the community I had called home. The priest's cold detachment was the final insult. Father Thomas stood at the altar, his face a mask of polite neutrality, his eyes barely flickering in my direction. The man who had once nodded to me with such authority now seemed to delight in my humiliation. The embarrassment was suffocating. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I blinked them back, unwilling to let the room see my pain. My body trembled, not just from the shock but from the awakening of a long-suppressed defiance. This was not how my story would end. When the reading finally concluded, the ceremony moved on as if nothing had happened. The hymns resumed, voices rising in song, but I remained seated, silent and small, my hands folded tightly over the closed Bible. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, heavy and relentless. In that instant I realized something profound. The church was not just the stone and stained glass, the rituals and prayers. It was the people, the voices, the hearts, the respect we owed to one another. And that respect had been trampled today. But I also felt a spark, a fragile flickering flame of resolve. If I was to reclaim my dignity and my faith, it would not be by silent submission. It would be by standing firm, by finding my voice even when it trembled. I looked once more at Catherine, her eyes still watching me, full of love and apology. I wanted to reach out, to tell her everything would be all right. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I gathered the Bible in my hands once more, pressed it to my chest, and took a slow, steadying breath. I would not let this moment define me. Not today, not ever. And so, with a heart both heavy and hopeful, I made the unspoken decision. This was the turning point. The moment when I would step out of the shadows and reclaim my place. Not just in the church but in my own life. Because sometimes the deepest wounds reveal the brightest paths forward. The rest of the ceremony passed like a blur. Faces smiled, glasses clinked, and blessings were spoken. But I was elsewhere. In a place where the pain was raw, yes, but where the first stirrings of courage had begun to rise. That night, I lay awake in the guest room at my daughter's new home. The soft rustle of leaves outside mingled with the distant hum of the city, a lullaby for a restless soul. I stared at the ceiling, the echo of the day's betrayal ringing in my ears. My hands were still trembling, but now with a different kind of energy. The storm inside me was no longer just fear and shame. It was a fierce determination. Tomorrow I promised myself I would speak. Not loudly, not in anger, but with the quiet strength of someone who knows their worth. The church may have silenced me today, but I was far from broken. I was beginning to find my voice. The sunlight had long faded by the time I finally slipped into the quiet of my daughter's new home. It was a modest place but warm, a sanctuary now foreign to me, yet filled with the echoes of laughter and love that had built our family. I sat in the corner of the living room, the hum of distant city life filtering through the windows. The day's events replayed relentlessly behind my closed eyelids, each frame sharper than the last, like a movie I couldn't pause or rewind. I could still feel the weight of the Bible in my hands, its thin pages trembling as if mirroring my own unrest. That moment at the pulpit when Father Thomas called Jennifer's name instead of mine wasn't just a slip or a misguided gesture. It was a calculated wound. I knew it deep in my bones. The years of quiet disagreements. I thought of Ruth's face when the announcement was made. The shock so raw it seemed to crack the veneer of calm I'd tried so hard to preserve. Ruth had been my rock for decades, a woman whose quiet wisdom wrapped around me like a warm shawl. I could almost hear her voice now, steady and reassuring, reminding me that I was not alone. But the image that haunted me most was Father Thomas himself. His eyes, cold and unreadable, had barely flickered in my direction. That deliberate dismissal. The slow, measured way he spoke my daughter's name, as if to underline the fact that I was invisible, dispensable. I had served this church with devotion for 50 years, yet in that moment, I was nothing more than a shadow to him. My lips pressed tightly together. I could almost sense the invisible walls he had built between us. Walls erected over years of silent battles and unspoken resentments. I had questioned his decisions before, gently at first, then more boldly as the years went by. The handling of donations, the quiet exclusion of voices like mine from important conversations. Each conflict piled into a mound of unresolved tension that finally tipped over that day. I remembered the day I first raised concerns about the charity funds. I had approached him with evidence, spreadsheets, and quietly gathered testimonies from other parishioners. I had hoped to protect the integrity of the church and the trust of our community. Instead, he had given me a curt dismissal, his voice low and final. Leave such matters to the council. From that moment, the distance between us had only grown. Yet it had never been personal, at least I had tried to believe that. It was about stewardship, respect, and the sacred responsibility we all shared. How naive I had been. To Father Thomas it seemed it was a matter of control, of maintaining his authority at any cost. The memory of Jennifer rising from her seat caused a fresh wave of bitterness. She had looked so uncertain, so unprepared, her voice faltering as she stumbled through the verses of Corinthians. I wondered if she too felt the weight of what was happening, caught in the crossfire of a quiet war I had been fighting for years. Had she known the reading was mine? Had she understood the significance of the moment? Or was she simply a pawn, unaware of the deeper wounds inflicted? I reached for my tea, now cold and forgotten on the side table. The cup felt heavy in my hands, grounding me in the present, even as my mind swirled with memories. I recalled the rehearsal the night before, the way Father Thomas had brushed past me, barely acknowledging my presence. His muttered "follow the program" had stung more than any harsh word. It was the silence that cut deepest, the silence that screamed of exclusion. The contrast between that night and the hopeful mornings spent with Catherine was dizzying. Back then I had felt a fragile sense of optimism. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. Maybe kindness and respect could prevail. But the rehearsal had shattered that illusion, exposing the truth beneath the polished veneer of tradition and ceremony. I thought back to the countless Sundays spent in that church, singing hymns, lighting candles, praying for guidance. The sanctuary had been my refuge, a place where faith and family intertwined in sacred harmony. But now it felt like a cage, a place where my voice was silenced, my presence erased. A pang of grief washed over me, not just for myself but for the community I loved, for the generations of women like me, who had quietly carried the burdens of faith while being pushed to the margins. How many others had been silenced, their gifts overlooked or stolen under the guise of order and tradition. My thoughts drifted to the future, the uncertain path ahead. I recalled the words I had spoken to Father Thomas during the reception, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside. The church is not a building, or a man with a collar. It is what we carry inside us. In that moment I had felt a flicker of power, a reclaiming of my dignity. I thought of the new church I would attend, the First Methodist Church across town. The thought of stepping into a different sanctuary, surrounded by a community that might truly see me, brought a glimmer of hope. I imagined the stained glass windows casting new patterns of light on wooden floors I would come to know. the voices of new friends singing old hymns with fresh hearts. But even as hope stirred, a shadow of doubt lingered. Would I be accepted there? Would the wounds inflicted by years of quiet exclusion heal? Could I rebuild a place for myself where respect and faith coexisted without fear? As these questions swirled, I found myself returning to the image of my daughter, Catherine, so full of life and grace, her eyes filled with worry that day. She had called me out to the garden after the ceremony, her voice trembling as she tried to explain. "Mama, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Her hands in mine, warm and trembling, had been the only solid thing in that moment. I had held her close, whispering the promise that this day, this betrayal, would not define her happiness or our bond. Yet, inside, I knew the ripples of that moment would extend far beyond the wedding day. The memory of her smile, fragile and brave as she danced with her new husband, Michael, was a balm to my wounded heart. It reminded me that life, like faith, was a journey marked by both joy and pain. That sometimes the deepest wounds opened the way for the most profound growth. I felt the weight of years pressing upon me, the decades of quiet submission, the countless battles fought in silence. But beneath that weight, a seed of defiance had taken root. I realized that my trembling hands were no longer just a sign of fear or shame, but of a voice emerging, fragile yet unyielding. I thought back to Ruth and the many afternoons she had listened patiently as I practiced the reading. Her gentle encouragement had been a lifeline, a reminder that I was more than the sum of my doubts and silences. "Your voice has the perfect balance," she had said. "Not too emotional, not too distant." Her words now carried new meaning. They were a call to rise above the shadows, to claim the strength that had always been there, but buried beneath layers of hurt and compromise. I reached for the Bible once more, opening it to the passage I had prepared. The words of Corinthians, familiar and sacred, seemed to glow with new light. I read them silently, letting each phrase settle deep within me. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast. For the first time, those words felt like a promise, not just for my daughter's marriage, but for my own journey ahead. A promise that love, even when tested by betrayal and silence, could still endure. I closed the book gently and placed it beside me. A quiet determination settled in my chest, steady and resolute. Tomorrow was a new day, a chance to find my voice again, to reclaim my place in a community that honored dignity and faith. No longer would I be silenced. No longer would I accept being invisible. The church may have tried to take my reading, my moment, my respect, but it could not take my spirit. And with that, I rose from the chair, my hands still trembling but my heart steady, ready to face whatever came next. The days that followed the wedding were heavy with a silence far more suffocating than any words could be. I had imagined there might be comfort or, at the very least, some acknowledgement from the people I had known all my life. But instead, the church community seemed to shrink away from me, like shadows retreating before the dawn. Those once warm smiles turned cold and distant, their eyes darting away when I met their gaze. At Sunday service, I arrived early, hoping to find a familiar face willing to break the growing frost between us. The wooden pews, polished smooth by decades of hands, felt sterile beneath my fingertips. The stained glass windows cast vibrant colors, but the light that filtered through seemed muted somehow, like the warmth had been drained from the room itself. I found my usual seat, the one I had occupied for countless years, but as I sat, I noticed the subtle shifts. A woman behind me whispered to her companion, glancing quickly over her shoulder. I caught fragments of phrases. Awkward. So unexpected. Uncomfortable. The voices hushed as soon as I turned, their warmth replaced by a brittle distance. Ruth sat a few rows back, her usual bright smile softened by concern. She caught my eye and gave a subtle nod, a silent reassurance that I was not entirely alone. But even her presence, steadfast as it was, couldn't fill the growing void around me. The murmurs didn't stay confined to the church walls. At the community center where I had volunteered for years, The atmosphere shifted palpably. People who once greeted me with open arms now offered only quick nods before turning their back. At home the silence echoed loudly. Catherine called often, her voice a bomb amidst the coldness, but even she was caught in the crossfire of whispers and sidelong glances. Michael's support was unwavering, but I could see the strain it placed on their new marriage. The wedding that should have been a joyous beginning was now tangled in the aftermath of a silent war I hadn't chosen but had been forced to fight. One afternoon as I walked through the neighborhood, I noticed subtle changes that I hadn't expected. Neighbors who once stopped to chat now averted their eyes, their greetings clipped and hurried. The postman paused briefly before handing me letters, his usual banter reduced to a curt "good afternoon." Even the friendly clerk at the local grocery store seemed hesitant, her smile faltering as I passed. At the church, the sense of isolation was most acute. The sanctuary that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a stage where I was both present and invisible. The volunteers who greeted me with warmth just weeks before now barely nodded, their conversations trailing off when I neared. The pews I once shared with dear friends felt empty, the silence oppressive. I found myself lingering outside the church after services, reluctant to step inside the cold echo of judgment. The familiar creak of the wooden doors, the scent of old hymnals and incense, the distant murmur of the organ, all these now seemed like distant memories trapped behind a barrier I could not cross. The whispers followed me like a shadow. I would catch snippets of conversation, voices lowered but sharp with implication. She should have known her place. It's not about her. It's about tradition. Perhaps it's time for a change, but that's not how things are done here. Each phrase was a blade, cutting away at the years of devotion and service I had poured into this community. The very faith that had once sustained me was now tangled with disappointment and exclusion. Ruth was my lifeline. One afternoon as we sat together in her cozy living room, the weight of it all pressed down on me. I could barely hold back the tears. It feels like I'm being erased, I confessed, my voice barely a whisper. Like I've become a ghost in the very place I called home. Ruth reached across and took my hand, her eyes steady and kind. They are afraid, Ellie, she said softly. Change makes people uncomfortable. But you are not a ghost. You are a woman of faith and courage. Don't let them silence you. Her words gave me strength, but the path ahead was still shrouded in uncertainty. Every encounter was a reminder of the isolation that had settled around me like a thick fog. I was learning painfully that community could be fragile and conditional, and that even faith could be wielded as a weapon. As the weeks passed, I noticed the subtle ways in which the church's power structure reinforced that exclusion. Invitations to committee meetings ceased. The parish newsletter no longer mentioned my contributions or volunteer work. Even the youngest members of the congregation seemed to sense the divide, their curious glances tinged with unspoken questions. I wondered how many others had been quietly pushed to the margins, their voices stifled beneath the weight of tradition and authority. How many stories like mine had been buried in the shadows where no one could see or hear them. One evening, as I sat alone in the dim light of my living room, I opened the Bible once again. The passage from Corinthians that had been taken from me echoed in my mind. Love is patient, love is kind. I recited the words softly to myself, feeling their power and their promise. The church might have tried to silence me, but my spirit was far from broken. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, marked by loneliness and challenge. But I also knew that I could no longer accept a faith that demanded my silence, that undermined my dignity. The isolation was real and it was painful, but it was also a crucible, a test of faith and resilience. And within it, I began to glimpse a new kind of strength, one born not from acceptance, but from the refusal to be erased. Slowly, I started to reach out beyond the walls of St. Michael's. I attended services at the First Methodist Church across town, where the people greeted me with open arms and genuine smiles. The sanctuary was new, but the light that filled it felt warmer, more inviting. Here my voice was welcomed and my presence honored. In those moments I felt the first stirrings of hope. The community I had lost was not the only one. Faith was not confined to a single building or a single leader. It was living, breathing, and evolving just as I was. Though the sting of rejection remained, I was learning to walk forward with grace. To carry the lessons of the past without being defined by them. To find a voice that, though it had once trembled, was now growing stronger with every step. The path was uncertain, but it was mine to walk. And for the first time in a long time I no longer felt alone. The moment the words left Father Thomas's lips, for the first reading we welcomed Jennifer Blackwood, something inside me shattered. It was like the air itself shifted. A sudden, suffocating stillness that wrapped around the entire sanctuary. The rich scent of polished wood and aged paper, usually comforting, felt heavy and oppressive. The faint hint of incense hanging in the air seemed to thicken, making each breath I took feel shallow and strained. I remember gripping the Bible tighter, trying to steady the trembling of my hands. The pages, fragile and thin, flickered like autumn leaves caught in a restless breeze. I could feel the texture of the paper beneath my fingers, rough and delicate at once, but my hold was unsteady, betraying the storm raging beneath my calm exterior. My heart pounded so loudly I feared it might drown out the murmurs of the congregation. Each beat hammered against my ribcage, a relentless reminder of the humiliation unfolding. I clasped my hands together, fingers interlacing tightly, as if trying to anchor myself to something solid. I breathed in slowly, willing the shaking in my chest to subside. The air tasted faintly of rose from the altar arrangements I had painstakingly funded, a cruel contrast to the bitterness curling in my throat. Around me, the 60 pairs of eyes were fixed as if a spotlight had been trained on my every move. I could almost feel the weight of their gazes pressing down on me, a silent judgment that made my skin crawl. Some faces were kind, others masked surprise or confusion, but most wore the quiet, unspoken discomfort of witnessing something they didn't quite understand. I caught Ruth's eye in the crowd, her mouth agape, her expression frozen in disbelief. She was my anchor, the voice of reason and support that had buoyed me through weeks of anxious preparation. Yet even her shock was powerless to break the spell that kept me rooted to the spot. Jennifer rose hesitantly from the opposite side of the sanctuary. Her green eyes flickered toward me, searching for an explanation that I could not provide. Her voice trembled slightly as she began to move forward, her carefully manicured nails clenching the edge of her hymnal. Our eyes met again, hers wide with uncertainty, mine a mixture of disbelief and searing humiliation. For a brief, suspended moment, the world narrowed to just the two of us. I wanted to speak, to demand an answer, but the words clotted in my throat. The silence was deafening. I could hear the faint shuffle of feet as Jennifer stepped toward the pulpit. The echo of her hesitant breathing filled the space between us. I wanted to catch my breath, to find a steady rhythm, but my chest felt constricted, as though my lungs had shrunk into a tight knot. The wooden floor beneath my feet was polished and gleaming, the familiar creaks and groans of the old church silenced by the tension hanging heavy in the air. The pulpit, usually a place where I felt a quiet sense of belonging, now seemed like a distant and inaccessible perch reserved for someone else. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to summon the calm I had cultivated over weeks of preparation. I pictured Ruth's encouraging smile, Catherine's hopeful gaze from that morning, the pearl brooch nestled near my heart, symbols of strength and continuity that had always grounded me. I took a slow, deliberate breath, counting to 5 before exhaling, trying desperately to steady the tremor that threatened to betray me. When I opened my eyes, Jennifer's voice was already rising, tentative but clear enough to carry across the sanctuary. "Love is patient, love is kind," she began, her tone faltering slightly on the familiar words of Corinthians. Each phrase was a knife twisting deeper into my chest, not because of the scripture itself, which I had cherished all my life, but because of what it represented. A moment stolen, a place denied, a voice silenced. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. A flush of I glanced toward the altar, where Father Thomas stood with a calm detachment that made my blood boil. His eyes rarely flickered in my direction, his expression unreadable, almost as if he were watching a play unfold, detached and unfeeling. The slow, deliberate way he had spoken Jennifer's name felt like a quiet punishment, a reminder of who held power in this community. My throat tightened painfully, and I fought the urge to leap to my feet, to shout out in protest. The silence stretched unbearable. I could feel the gaze of friends and strangers alike, a collective breath held in uncomfortable suspense. The sanctuary, usually filled with hymns and prayer, was now a cage that trapped me in a moment of public humiliation. Catherine's eyes searched mine from the front pew, filled with a mixture of sorrow and helplessness. I wished I could reach out to her, to tell her that this was not her fault, that her day would still be beautiful despite the shadows cast over it. But my voice was buried beneath layers of pain and shock. Michael, my son-in-law, glanced between us, his brow furrowed in silent question. He looked as stunned as I felt, caught off guard by the unexpected rift forming before everyone's eyes. The congregation shifted uneasily, some coughing to break the tension, others exchanging whispered glances. The fragrance of the lilies and roses I had chosen for the altar mixed with the faint scent of old wood and candle wax, creating an atmosphere thick with contrast, the beauty of the moment marred by the ugliness of exclusion. I closed my eyes again, trying to gather the shattered pieces of my composure. My breath came slow and steady, a fragile lifeline tethering me to the present. I reminded myself that I had prepared for this moment, that the words of Corinthians were mine to claim no matter who spoke them aloud. But the hurt was deep, and the betrayal sharp. This was not a mere oversight. It was a message clear and cruel. A reminder that my place was not at the pulpit, not in the spotlight. That after 50 years of devotion, I was still invisible to those who held the strings. When Jennifer's reading finally came to an end, the sanctuary remained engulfed in a heavy silence. The choir began softly humming the next hymn, their voices attempting to fill the void that the moment had left behind. I sat quietly, Bible closed in my lap, hands still trembling ever so slightly. The pages of the book seemed foreign now. Words that had once brought me comfort, now a bitter reminder of the gulf between the faith I carried in my heart and the cold reality around me. As the service continued, I felt the weight of eyes still upon me, many filled with questions they dared not voice aloud. The warmth of the flowers, the sunlight filtering through the stained glass, the flickering candles, none of it could mask the sting of rejection. I realized then that this moment was a turning point. The sanctuary that had once been my refuge had become a battleground. But amidst the shame and hurt, a new feeling took root, a quiet but fierce resolve. I would not be silenced. Not by tradition. Not by authority. Not by the whispered judgments of a community that failed to see me. I looked once more at Catherine, her face a portrait of love and pain, and I silently vowed to find my voice again, to reclaim my place, not just in the pews or the pulpit, but in the heart of the faith I had nurtured all my life. Because sometimes the deepest wounds break us open in ways that allow the most profound healing. And this was my moment, not of defeat but of awakening. The days that followed the wedding unfolded in an eerie silence that felt heavier than any sermon I had ever heard. I woke each morning hoping that the nightmare of that moment, the moment Father Thomas called Jennifer's name instead of mine, was just a cruel illusion. But the weight of reality pressed down with relentless force. The church, once a refuge, seemed to grow colder, its walls closing in like a cage that I could not escape. I remember sitting alone in the quiet of my home, the familiar space now feeling strangely unfamiliar. The gentle hum of the city outside contrasted sharply with the turmoil swirling inside me. My hands, still shaky from that day, trembled as I folded and refolded the church bulletin Catherine had brought back from the reception. The words printed there, the order of service, the names of readers, had been overwritten, changed without a word to me. My name erased like a whisper in the wind. I thought of all the years I had devoted to this community, the countless hours volunteering, the prayers said for every family, every crisis, every joy. I poured my heart into this parish, believing that faith was about love and respect. But that belief now felt fragile, as if it had been built on shifting sands. The sting of exclusion was sharp and relentless. I found myself withdrawing, afraid to meet the eyes of those who once greeted me warmly. At Sunday service I took my usual seat, only to find empty spaces where friends had once sat. Conversations hushed as I approached, replaced by awkward glances and polite, distant smiles that barely masked discomfort. Ruth was my sanctuary in those days. One afternoon, as we sat in her cozy living room, she reached across the coffee table and squeezed my hand gently. "Ellie, you are not alone," she said softly. "They may try to silence your voice, but they cannot silence your spirit." Her words warmed me, but they also reminded me of the painful truth. I was standing at a crossroads. The church I had known, the community I had loved, was no longer a place where I felt seen or valued. The following Sunday I arrived early, hoping to speak with Father Thomas. I wanted answers, a chance to understand the cold dismissal, the public slight. But he was nowhere to be found. The sacristy was empty, the altar bare. His absence spoke volumes. That day, as the congregation gathered, I watched from a distance as Jennifer Blackwood read from the lectern once again. Her voice was steady and polished, but I detected a flicker of hesitation in her eyes when they met mine. It was a silent exchange, one that held a fragile apology, though no words were spoken. I thought about Catherine, how her radiant smile at the altar had masked the hurt beneath. After the ceremony, she had taken me aside in the garden, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Mama, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Her hands gripped mine tightly, a lifeline that kept me anchored. Despite the pain, I refused to let this humiliation define me or break the bond one shared with my daughter. I promised her and myself that I would find a way forward. That promise led me to a decision I had not anticipated but came to embrace with quiet certainty. The church that had been my home for 50 years was no longer the sanctuary I needed. It was a place where tradition had been weaponized, and where respect was conditional. A week later, I visited the First Methodist Church across town, a place Catherine had suggested. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a breath of fresh air. The sanctuary was bright and welcoming, the faces open and kind. The warmth was palpable, a stark contrast to the coldness I had left behind. During the service, when the pastor asked for volunteers to read scripture in the coming weeks, I was the first to raise my hand. My voice still trembled, but there was a new strength behind it. A voice reclaimed the words of Corinthians, the very passage I had memorized for weeks, flowed from my lips with a clarity and conviction I had not known I possessed. The congregation listened with warmth and respect, their eyes kind and encouraging. For the first time in a long time I felt seen. In the weeks that followed, I found more than a new church. I found a community that valued me not for my wealth, my history, or my silence, but for my faith and my voice. The friendships I forged were genuine, built on mutual respect and understanding. Back at St. Michael's, word of my departure spread quietly. Some whispered about the change I had chosen, others about the rifts that had grown too wide to mend. But I no longer carried the weight of their judgments. I was free. One Sunday afternoon I received a letter, unsigned, but unmistakably from someone within my former parish. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a confession of sorts. It detailed concerns about how Father Thomas had handled parish funds, echoing the very issues I had raised years before. The writer expressed regret for not standing with me and a hope that I had found peace. That letter was both a balm and a beacon. It was proof that my voice mattered, that my concerns had not been unfounded. It was a reminder that change often comes slowly, sometimes painfully, but that truth has a way of surfacing. I kept the letter tucked safely in my Bible. The church pew where I had sat for decades stood empty now, the polished wood gleaming softly under the filtered light streaming through the stained glass. The colors danced quietly on the floor, shards of crimson, sapphire, and gold, that seemed to whisper stories of generations past, stories I had once been a part of. But today that pew was mine no longer. I stood just outside the doors of St. Michael's, the heavy oak framed by the late afternoon sun. The air was cool, carrying the sharp scent of early autumn leaves mixed with the faint remnants of incense, an aroma that once breathed life into my faith but now only stirred memories of silence and exclusion. My hands, still marked with the tremble that had become part of me, rested lightly on the worn handle of my purse. I hesitated, a moment suspended between past and future. Inside, the sanctuary was quiet, empty except for the gentle echo of distant footsteps, perhaps a janitor finishing the day's tasks or a late volunteer tidying the pews. The familiar creak of the wooden floor seemed sharper, more pronounced in the hush. It was as if the very building was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. I turned slowly, taking in the grandeur one last time. The towering arches, the flickering candles, the altar where so many prayers had been whispered. The lilies and roses I had once funded had long since wilted, their petals scattered and forgotten beneath the soft sweep of the caretaker's broom. Yet, even in their absence, I could still feel the weight of that day, the humiliation, the betrayal, but also the quiet rebellion that had taken root in my heart. The wind stirred outside, sending a gentle gust through the trees that lined the churchyard. Leaves rustled softly, a natural hymn of change and letting go. I took a deep breath, the crisp air filling my lungs with a clarity I had not known before. This was the moment, the turning point I had long anticipated but feared. The moment to close the door on what had been and step boldly into what would be. As I started to walk away, my footsteps echoed against the stone steps, the sound steady and sure. Each step was a small reclaiming, a silent declaration that I would no longer be defined by the walls that tried to contain me. The sound of the heavy door closing behind me was soft but final, a gentle thud that resonated in the quiet afternoon. The church that had been my home for over 50 years now stood behind me, its doors shut against the fading light. But the faith I carried was not bound to bricks or traditions. It was alive inside me, in the warmth of my daughter's hand, in the encouragement of my dear friend Ruth, in the new community that had welcomed me with open arms and open hearts. I glanced back once more, the stained glass windows catching the sun and casting a kaleidoscope of light that seemed to reach out, not in invitation but in farewell. I smiled sadly, a mixture of grief and gratitude filling my chest. I had loved this place deeply, and it had shaped me in ways I could never forget. But sometimes love means knowing when to walk away, when to find a new path where your voice can rise unafraid. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine. I felt the tremble in my hands, not as a sign of weakness, but as a reminder of the strength born from vulnerability. With each step, that strength grew, weaving a quiet song of resilience and hope. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pavement, I felt a peace settle over me, a soft promise that this ending was really a beginning. The footsteps behind me faded into the distance, replaced by the gentle sigh of the wind carrying away the last echoes of a chapter closed. And in that silence I heard my voice, steady now, clear, ready to be heard again. The last rays of sunlight slipped quietly through the window, casting long, soft shadows across the wooden floor of my new home. The gentle hum of city life seeped through the walls, a distant reminder that the world outside continued, unaware, indifferent, yet filled with endless possibilities. I sat alone, the flicker of a single candle throwing playful patterns against the cream-colored walls, its flame steady despite the stillness around me. In my hands rested the Bible I had carried to the church that day, the one whose pages had fluttered like fragile autumn leaves in my trembling grip. Now those pages held a different weight, a witness to a journey marked not by silent submission but by the quiet courage to rise. I remembered how it all began, the hope and pride I felt waking that morning, the scent of blueberry pancakes wafting through the house as Catherine's smile lit the room, the way her eyes had shone with trust when she asked me to read the scripture. It had been a moment I had cherished for weeks, rehearsing each word with a devotion that went beyond faith, beyond ritual. It was my chance to stand in the light, to be seen not just as a mother, but as a woman who had walked through storms and carried love like armor. And yet, the sanctuary that was supposed to be a place of grace became a stage for humiliation. When Father Thomas's voice rang out, calling Jennifer Blackwood's name instead, the world tilted on its axis. The pages of my Bible trembled, but what shook most was the foundation beneath me. The trust, the community, the years of silent loyalty unraveling in a single cold moment. The sting of that betrayal was sharp, its edges cutting deep into the fabric of my faith and identity. But even in those painful seconds, as I lowered the Bible to my lap and watched Jennifer stumble over the words I had so lovingly memorized, a quiet flame began to kindle within me. A flame fueled not by bitterness but by a growing resolve, a determination to reclaim my place, my voice, and my dignity. In the days and weeks that followed, the silence around me was deafening. The church pews grew emptier, the smiles colder. The community I had nurtured now seemed a distant shore, receding with every passing day. I felt like a ghost in the very place I had called home, a shadow fading beneath the weight of unspoken judgments and fading friendships. But even ghosts leave marks. Even silence carries a message. It was Ruth's unwavering friendship, the gentle encouragement of a kindred spirit, and the steady warmth of Catherine's love that became my anchor. Together they reminded me that faith is not confined by walls or worn by the collar of a man, but lives in the hearts of those courageous enough to hold on to it, even when the world tries to snatch it away. When I stepped into the First Methodist Church across town for the first time, I felt something I had not known in years: belonging. The faces that greeted me were open, the hymns welcoming, and the invitation to lift my voice no longer carried the weight of fear. As I read the scriptures there, my voice steady despite the tremble beneath, I found in those words a new beginning, not just for me but for the faith I carry forward. The church is more than a building. It is more than traditions or rituals. It is the living, breathing community that chooses compassion over control, inclusion over exclusion. And sometimes it takes being silenced to finally hear your own voice. I carry the lessons of that day, of betrayal and heartbreak, of courage and renewal, in the deepest chambers of my heart. They are the stories I tell myself when doubt creeps in, the quiet truths that steady my trembling hands and lift my voice higher. I learned that faith is not about unquestioning acceptance. It is about standing tall even when the ground shifts beneath you. It is about holding on to love, patient, kind, unyielding, even when the world forgets to see it. And so I walk forward not to forget but to remember, to honor the voice that trembled yet refused to be silenced, to cherish the strength born from vulnerability, to embrace the sanctuary found not in stone or stained glass, but in the courage to stand, to speak, and to love without apology. Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truths, and mine will never be still again. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.